Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here. It's nice to see everyone. I hope all of you enjoyed a very nice and wonderful Easter and Passover celebrations if you celebrated either holiday. I hope you enjoyed some time with family and friends and you were able to take a deep breath as we get started with now another new week. Today is April 13th. This is the fourth Monday session of this financial support group, the Coping with COVID group, and it's really, really lovely to see so many familiar faces. For those of you who are new or don't know me, my name is Elaine. It's lovely to meet you. I am a CPA with a personal financial specialist designation and accredited financial counselor. And all of my work is with creative individuals and organizations all around the country. So it's really wonderful and a privilege to be having these conversations. Of course, we do want to acknowledge, as I do every week, that this information is educational in nature. It is not intended to be tax, accounting, or legal advice. It's also important to know that new information is unfolding as it relates to the various programs of assistance and the coronavirus in general. That's all unfolding kind of in real time. So make sure you are keeping up with the most current information. So what I thought we'd do today, as we have done in previous weeks, is go through some relevant updates. There's one new key piece of information that's good, and then some other good news that I've heard over the past week. We'll answer some submitted questions that I got from people who registered in advance of today. And of course, we'll be here providing some support for each other. I thought it would be helpful as well to think about maybe just some ground rules. And if you have been following along or if you've listened to other webinars I've done for Creative Capital or the Indiana Arts Commission, some of this might be familiar. But the overall ground rule that we have all learned about when it comes to dealing with a pandemic is to wash your hands all the time, regularly, with soap for a sufficient period of time, and to listen to the things the experts are saying. And if I were to articulate a financial ground rule as we are all going through this, the financial ground rule that's sort of the equivalent of washing your hands is to do the math. It is so important that you just keep an idea or keep some math around what your financial situation is looking like. So that means keeping an idea of how much money you have in savings, what your expenses are on a regular basis, maybe keeping an eye on those debt balances if you are accumulating debt right now. Just keep doing the math so that you can stay on top of this, so that you don't find yourself in a position where things have completely spun out of control. So with that idea and the ground rule of do the math in mind, I thought it would be helpful to walk through some of that math. Again, this might be familiar. We talked about this 4 weeks ago together, but it's probably a good time to revisit it. And if you have some time this week, see if you can set aside 15 minutes or so just to kind of check in with your own financial health. And the first part of that is understanding where you stand. So this would be a snapshot of your assets and then the debt you have right now. So when we think about your assets, what I'm really talking about is the money you have in your checking account and in your savings account, right? What is that cash you have on hand right now? If you have other assets, so other investment accounts or maybe retirement accounts or maybe a home or a car or other things like that, you can keep an eye on those balances as well. But what we're really interested in right now is basically the cash you have on hand. It's also important to understand from a snapshot perspective how much debt you have. So thinking about what those credit card balances are, the outstanding balances that you might be working to pay off or you will get to paying off when things settle down. Keep an eye on what those balances are and make sure they don't go up too much, although we know it may be unrealistic to think they won't go up at all. But also if you have other debt, whether that is a car loan or a mortgage or student loan debt, keep an eye on what some of those debt balances might be as well. For many of you, those debt balances have been paused, which is kind of nice. So if you have federal student loans, if you log on to your servicer for those federal student loans, you will show that there is no payment due right now, which is nice. The total balance is paused as we're getting through this pandemic together. If you have other types of debt and you have reached out to someone like a mortgage service provider or your bank or whoever holds the debt for your car loan, you may know that that amount has paused as well. or that amount could be accruing interest, so the total debt balance might be going up. Whatever your reality is, just keep an eye on what that balance is. It's a good sort of moment to take a snapshot of what those balances look like. And there's no judgment associated with what those balances are, but it's a good idea to kind of keep an eye on them so that you can make informed decisions going forward. So with that, one of the questions that came in this week, and I thought it was a really good one to address right now, is the question, how much money should I have in savings? And so I want to answer this in a couple of different ways. The first way is, let's just talk about your emergency savings reserve fund under totally normal circumstances. What we would want is to look at what it costs you to exist as a human in the way you want to exist, and what it costs you to run your creative practice in the way you want to run it. And if we get a sense of what those numbers are on a monthly basis, and they might be average numbers or ish numbers because, sometimes the numbers are all over the place, as we know. But if you can get a sense of what those average numbers are for each month, we'll add those together. And I would call that sort of your minimum monthly costs. What we would want to do is multiply that number by 3 or 6. If you multiply it by 3 and you get that total, then you'll have enough cash on hand in savings to pay for your expenses for a 3-month period without having any income. If we multiply your monthly amount by 6, then you have 6 months worth of expenses covered, right? So in normal times, as a general rule, it is a really good idea to have that amount of cash in a checking account or a savings account on a regular basis. And that's because in the arts, income fluctuates. It's also because sometimes things happen. Sometimes they're not quite as major as what's happening right now, but sometimes things happen and we might not have income for a period of time. And if that's the case, if you have some quick, easily accessible pot of money, again, in a savings account or a checking account, that is enough to cover between 3 and 6 months of your expenses, that's a really good place to be. I have 12 here in parentheses because for some individuals, I do really like to see them grow that number even more. And that's in part because if you and your partner or others who earn money in your household are relying on freelance income or other sources of income that might be relatively unstable, it's not a bad idea to have close to a year's worth of income saved, just in case. If you are in a situation where you are caring for an aging parent, or maybe you have a child with special needs or someone else, and you have, cash on hand that's enough to cover that amount, that's a really good idea as well. So maybe that means you would have 12 months worth of expenses in a checking account or a savings account, right? So for some individuals, 3 to 6 months is totally fine. And if you are just getting started, yeah, aim for 3 months, and then we'll touch base after you've reached that goal. If you've been doing this for a while and you can get to a point where you've got 12 months worth of savings on hand, that is a really, really good position to be in. Now, my part B of answering this question is that we are in the middle of a crazy situation, right? Where your savings are probably going to be depleted or at least go down a little bit. And so that's okay, right? This is why we have emergency reserve funds, but you'll want to be replenishing this as things go back to normal. So a good rule of thumb is if you can aim to save, say, 10 to 15% of everything you earn, that's a really good spot to be in. And that's what I would advise saving towards this emergency fund if you can. So let's pretend, we get through this and things get back to normal and you have a gig or a performance or you sell a work for $1,000. Maybe because you're a freelancer, you're going to set aside $200 to $300 of that for taxes. And then maybe you say, okay, that amount is going to go to taxes. I'm going to set aside another $150, 15% of that, into an emergency fund just so I start rebuilding it. That's not a bad rule of thumb as you think about getting paid and then what you're going to do with that cash you have earned, right? So that might be a good rule of thumb to internalize going forward. The other piece of savings that I think it's helpful to think about is really, really long-term savings. So let's pretend you were saving up for retirement, or maybe you're saving up for graduate school or college for your child, right? Any of these more long-term savings goals that you might have that might be substantial in terms of the amount you have to save. There are different calculators online you can find that sort of give you an estimate of how much money you should have at various points in your life, especially as you're planning for retirement. But again, that quick 10 to 15% rule of thumb is not a bad place to be. So if your salary is, say, $10,000 a year, you would want to save 15% of that for your retirement. Remember, you're saving 10 to 15% of that for your emergency fund as well. So this would be on top of that. So I hope that's helpful. I have a question in the chat I'd love to address. This question is, what do you think is a good percentage of emergency fund to use for this pandemic? And this person says they have 12 months saved, but they don't want to spend everything right now because it took them a decade increasing that amount so that they could have 12 months worth of savings. This person also shares that based on their type of creativity, it might be a long time before things get back to normal and they're able to kind of replenish. So first of all, congrats on being able to accumulate that emergency reserve fund, right? Because this is why we have it. And as you're thinking about how much of it to spend, I would let your expenses or your budget dictate how much you want to dip into that emergency fund. Because you know, you can dip into it. It does exist to be used in a really wonderful situation. I'd love to see you not spend more than half of it if you can get away with that. And that really requires you to spend as little as possible right now. So that might be prioritizing food and medicine and healthcare costs, of course, but also maybe that means making partial payments towards some of the debt that is still accumulating interest, so you don't have to pay that interest later. Maybe that means having conversations maybe with your landlord or others to see about minimizing payments. Maybe that means investigating with your utility whether or not they have suspended payments or suspended accounts. Basically taking the steps to kind of really do the math and look at your own budget and say, okay, what is the absolute minimum amount I can spend that makes sense for me reasonably? And then dip into your savings account or your emergency fund for that. But if you're looking for a quick sort of percentage, I'd say if you can get away with spending half or less of your emergency fund, that would be a really fantastic place to be. Because the emergency fund is built based on your real costs for a normal month. And as we all know, this is not a normal month. March wasn't normal. May probably won't be normal. So there might be some natural ways for you to spend less during that time period, which means you have to dip into your emergency fund less so that it could, in theory, last longer. Great question. And congrats again to that person for accumulating that emergency fund, because that's not easy to do. The next question that came up that's kind of related to this is, what do I have to spend over the next period of time? We can talk about 1 month, we can talk about 2 months, kind of whatever time frame or time period you're thinking about right now. What do you have to spend? We're focusing on your essential costs to exist as a human and as a creator. And it's important to really get a sense of what those numbers are. And as I mentioned in response to the last question, we're talking about food and medicine sort of first and foremost. And then we're thinking about all of your other kind of necessary costs. This would be sort of shelter, maybe debt payments, depending on what kind of debt it is. If there is flexibility to spend less in any other areas, it's a really good time to think about what that looks like for you. So maybe you have an ongoing gym membership that you can pause or suspend, or maybe you have subscriptions to various services like streaming services, and maybe you say, okay, I'm only going to subscribe to one right now and pause the rest. I know that's not sort of pleasant, but it's important that you do your own math and figure out, okay, what are really my essential costs and how much of my emergency fund am I going to devote to those, and what other sources of income do I have to fund those options? And you get to sort of be in charge of making the choice of saying, okay, I would rather dip into my emergency fund and pay for these 3 things that are still essential to me. But I want you to be making that choice on purpose because you've done the math, as opposed to just because you haven't really been thinking about it or you've fallen into habits. A question that came in this week that I thought was another good one is, how do we approach a nonprofit landlord about rent reduction during this time when we don't have access to our studio to work? I love this question because I think it sort of gets at the point that we can talk about, hey, talk to your landlord and see if there's any flexibility. But unless we're really taking the steps to kind of model out what that looks like, sometimes that's a really abstract idea, and that's hard for someone to take from a PowerPoint presentation and then turn it into a conversation. So what I would say for this person is, there is strength in numbers. So if this is a nonprofit landlord who's overseeing a studio space where a number of people have studios, talk to all those other individuals and see if collectively you can approach the landlord to see what might be reasonable. So get as many people in the building on board as you can, right? As opposed to everybody trying to negotiate individually. I would also suggest that you lead with empathy. The landlord is struggling right now, just like everyone else is. So I think as you approach them, acknowledging that you know it's a really tough time to be a landlord right now because maybe their mortgage servicer is not being flexible about mortgage payments, or maybe other things are going on, right? We really never know exactly what's going on in someone else's life. So if you can lead with empathy, with that strength in numbers, that could be a really effective option. I also like presenting alternatives. So one option could be saying, hey, none of us are able to pay our rent for April, May, or June. Could we pause our leases, right? And that might be a really good option, and that might be the reality. If you talk to everybody else and everybody can maybe pay 50% of what the lease is, or 50% of a month's rent, that's also something you could think about offering to the landlord, because offering 50% of a normal rent instead of nothing might give them a little bit more flexibility. What we're seeing from a lot of sort of anecdotal stories is that often landlords are willing to sort of pause payments, and then some people are adding those missed months to the end of the lease term. So let's say you're in a 1 or 2 year lease right now for your studio space, and you're not able to use it for, say, March, April, and May. You could take those 3 months and say, okay, normally this lease was going to end on December 31st. Let's extend it to January, February, March 31st of next year. So we're extending the lease by those 3 months, and I will pay for those 3 months instead of paying for these 3 months right now. And if the landlord has flexibility on their mortgage payment, then that might be something they're willing to do. It also takes some of the pressure off of them trying to find a new tenant at the end of this year when things may be unsettled to begin with. So that would be a really good thing to offer. Another option, if landlords aren't really open to that, is pausing payments in whole or in part for, say, March, April, and May, and then taking those missed payments and then dividing them by the remaining lease term. So if things get normal again in June, instead of paying 3 months of back rent in June, which is not possible from a cash flow perspective, you would basically take the total amount of missed payments and then divide it by, say, 6 months if there are 6 months left in your lease. And so that way each month might be a little bit more. If that's the situation you're looking at, it might make more sense for you to pay half of your lease right now so that there's less to add to future months. But again, depending on what the landlord is comfortable with, that really is a conversation for you to have with the other tenants and the landlord to make sure that everybody's needs are being met. I do like the idea as well of sort of role playing what that conversation might sound like. I know that sounds really weird, but this is an exercise I do with a lot of clients, sort of one-on-one. And when you actually have to say the words to someone who's pretending to be the landlord, it's amazing how much easier it goes. So if you want to do that exercise, you can certainly email me and we'll find a time to do that. Or you can talk to some of the other tenants in the studio space, or talk to your partner or a friend or anyone else, and just kind of model how that conversation might go. And that's a good way to sort of practice what some of the words might be so that they're a little bit more natural when they're coming out of your mouth. So hopefully that's a little bit more helpful. There's another question in the chat. Let's see, this person shares that the landlord isn't being helpful, so they're still paying their full rent amount, but they are basically looking for other ways to cut expenses. That's another option as well. It is possible that your landlord will not be flexible. It's not a bad idea to review the laws in the city and state where you live just to see what protections you have. That's not a terrible thing just to be aware of, especially now. So for example, if you miss a certain number of payments or there's some time period before the landlord can start eviction proceedings or something, right? So get an idea of what your rights are as a tenant in your city and state. But if there is no flexibility, maybe you ask the landlord of the studio to shut off the utilities for a period of time to reduce the rent. Or maybe you say, okay, that's not flexible, but I can look for these other areas to save. So, you know, it's a little bit of a chess game with moving parts because you're not totally certain how those conversations will go. But I would encourage you to go ahead and have the conversation. Practice first and then have the conversation. This question came in and I thought it was an interesting one. The question is, should I stop making work, spending money on materials since everything is canceled? And I really appreciated this question because it kind of builds on something we talked about last week about people struggling when it comes to motivation. And I think this is almost a practical application of that idea. And I would say you could certainly, if you were making work for a particular thing that has been canceled, yeah, it might make sense to stop that. If you were a costume designer and you were designing costumes for a show in April that has been suspended or postponed until April of next year or canceled completely, yeah, maybe you go ahead and stop or pause on that. But maybe if you're thinking about a general body of work, maybe you don't need to stop. And if you feel so inclined to keep making work, I'd encourage you to do that. I was having a conversation this morning with a writer who is a little bit contrarian in the best possible way. They had been struggling creatively since about last summer because of a long list of reasons. But now all of a sudden they're feeling really jazzed and inspired to keep writing right now. Nothing about the pandemic. They are very clear that they are not writing about the pandemic, but the things that had been sort of churning around in their brain at the end of last year are now kind of spilling out. And I think that's amazing. If you are a visual artist and you're kind of feeling that way, I say go nuts, build up that body of work, because at some point things will rebound a little bit. And it would be really nice to have a couple of different shows that you can start applying to shows for, applying to festivals, depending on kind of what your channels are. It's not a bad idea if you are able to continue making work to build up that body of work now. Now, if you're not there and if you can't, that's okay too, right? So I think if you are thinking about something very specific that has been canceled, I might not spend money on making that work unless you have really good insight into the fact that it is still going to rebound at some point in the future. But I don't think that you have to stop making work completely if that's not something that's required of you right now. And the other way of thinking about this is sort of stepping back and saying, okay, what is my value of an artist? If you've taken workshops with me, you know we call this the unique value proposition, and we spend a lot of time kind of distilling what you do into a pretty tight description. So it's not a bad time to really kind of look at that and see, what is it that I do? And remember, we're going for like action verbs here, things you do, as opposed to nouns that describe you. So an artist or a writer or something like that. So if you can get some clarity around what that is, or if you've done it and it still applies and you just kind of dust it off and remember what that is, I think it's interesting to think about how you can continue to provide that value to those you serve in a slightly different way. It won't be the exact same thing, but you can still continue to serve the community, whether that means actively selling, thinking about selling in an online or digital context, or if that means thinking about making work or contributing to your larger body of work so that when you're ready to start applying for things again, you have a couple of really good things that you feel good about applying for. On that note, another question that came in this week was about ideas to sell virtually to a local community. I will tell you, I have heard very mixed anecdotes about how selling virtually has been going. There was a virtual art fair that I sort of popped into this weekend, and the results were really kind of mixed. It was each individual was sort of driving their own sales process, and it almost felt like people were I don't want to say cannibalizing each other's sales, but with everyone driving their own sales, it wasn't necessarily super streamlined. A couple of weeks ago, I went to a virtual gallery hop where everyone was sort of on the same page, and it was more of a community-led effort rather than an individualized effort. And the numbers that came out of that event were fantastic. The sellers did really well, about as they would have done in a very good gallery hop in not a pandemic setting. But also because the community was supporting it, the engagement numbers and the marketing numbers they had based on sort of percentage of impressions and engagement and new eyeballs going to this particular website, those numbers were fantastic. So I would encourage you, if you are thinking about selling virtually, what does that mean? There is definitely strength in numbers, especially if there's kind of consistency among the group. And if you can partner with a group that has a fairly large reach, maybe that's a city arts council, or maybe that's a sort of a district in your neighborhood that already has a pretty robust email list group, or if there's another company or organization with a following that you can partner with, that could be a way to kind of amplify your message and make sure everybody's sort of on the same page. And that could be something interesting to think about. However, if everybody's sort of doing it and you find that it's not really worth your time, maybe that's a really good thing to sort of file away so that you could spend your time in a slightly different way. I heard another anecdote. There was a visual artist who was doing sort of a virtual open studio time or studio hours, and they were having a lot of issues with people jumping in uninvited to the virtual space and causing all sorts of problems. So I think, to the extent that you can build some community around this idea and really make sure you're putting in time that is going to yield results by partnering with others and sort of sharing the load, I think that's not a terrible strategy. I also think it's important to kind of step back and say, okay, am I doing this to serve my existing community, or am I doing this to build a new community? And if you're doing it to serve your existing community, for me, that might be reaching out to, say, your 15 best customers, the people who always come to your shows or always come to your things. Maybe they've bought work, maybe they've commissioned work, whoever your sort of greatest customers are. Maybe you reach out to 15 of them, or 30 or 40, depending on your customer base. and see if they want to come to a behind the scenes something that you're organizing. And you can include sort of invitation messaging language that says, you know, it's a tough time for artists. I'd love to show you what I'm working on and maybe pre-sell some of this new body of work I've been creating, or something like that. I think something like that could work really well if an individual is putting it on. But I don't know necessarily that you as an individual spending time to create a new community or a new audience makes sense right now. That just doesn't feel like it's the best use of your time or energy unless there's a really natural, organic opportunity that you're really excited about. This question, I think, is a really, really good one. And it was hard to read, and I imagine it was even harder for the person to write. But the question is, how do I compartmentalize all of my grief, stress, emotions in order to do the little bit of paid work that I still have? So I love that this person has some paid work still. I think that's good. It's a nice anchor during the day. And what I have noticed is that the paid work, well, let me see if I can say this differently. Time feels different right now. I think a lot of individuals are spending more time doing things that they might not necessarily regularly be doing, whether that is helping children with schoolwork, or maybe that is spending more time doing dishes, maybe it's more time cooking, whatever it is. I think we're spending more time not working, and I think that has to be acknowledged, because that might mean that you are spending fewer hours doing paid work or making work in your studio because you're also grocery shopping for a friend, or, you know, calling your elderly relatives more regularly, whatever it is. I think it's important to kind of acknowledge how our time has shifted a little bit. Also, a number of people have shared that they're not sleeping quite as well. So that might mean that they're sluggish, or they're a little bit slower to start during the day, or it takes longer to get going. So I think it's important to understand that time has shifted. So I would encourage you, to the extent that you can, to go ahead and schedule the time you need for that paid work. If you have it scheduled, and whatever that means to you, some people love calendars or lists or time blocks, right? Whatever works for you. I would go ahead and schedule that time and kind of honor the commitment you're making to it, whether it's 90 minutes a day or 6 hours a day, or, you know, 2-3 hour chunks, whatever feels right to you. Go ahead and schedule that time. And then make sure you're also scheduling time for everything else you are doing. So all that additional emotional labor, the additional work that you are doing that maybe someone else had done previously, whatever it is, schedule time for all that extra stuff as well, because it's not going away right now. And it's important that you have enough breathing room within your day to take care of those things. And then schedule some time for processing the grief and the stress and the emotions. And schedule some time for self-care, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe that is a virtual therapy session. Maybe that is exercise. Maybe it is vacuuming. I have no idea. But whatever your self-care is, make sure you're prioritizing some time for that and carving out enough time for that in your schedule. Because if you're not, all of those emotions are going to be sneaking into everything you're doing, whether it's work or family time or emotional labor you're doing, right? And so to the extent that you can kind of carve out some time for working, completing that paid work that you still have, and then for all that other stuff, I think that'll be a good way to kind of set some boundaries in your life about kind of when you're going to be processing this stuff, because everyone does need to sort of acknowledge the big feelings that are going on here. There's a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of guilt. There's a lot of stress. There is panic in some cases, anxiety, depression, elation, all sorts of things are going on. And all of those things are okay. But I think you need to make sure that you're acknowledging that time is functioning different right now, and give yourself the time that you need. So in terms of the support that's available, some good news that has come out over the past week or so is that I've heard anecdotally of at least 3 different people getting unemployment checks, which is very exciting. I know they were very, very relieved by that. I've heard people getting notifications from their bank about being approved for some of those PPP loans that were going out, which is very exciting. And then I have heard that some of the stimulus payments have started showing up in people's bank accounts. I don't know anyone who has received their cash yet. So if you are one of those people, let me know because I'd love to kind of get that confirmed from a human that I know or have some interaction with. But we are hearing reports that those stimulus payments, kind of the first round of them, are going out. Oh, and someone just shared in the chat that they received their stimulus payment. Congratulations. Now I believe all of the reporting, right? I think that's really, really wonderful news. So that's the good news, right? The unemployment is coming, the stimulus is coming, and people are getting approvals from various small business administration programs they've applied to, and also from community foundations and other sort of local sources of support that they may have applied to. That is the good news. Oh, and there's another question in the chat. The 3 individuals who got their unemployment, they were, 2 of them were freelancers and 1 was a W-2 employee. So there are freelancers that have started getting their unemployment money. Again, that totally depends on the state where you live in, because some states really jumped in early and were able to process things for freelancers. Other states have encouraged people to kind of slow down and wait for their systems to be built. I think last week, or maybe it was 10 days ago, Maryland was saying, nope, don't apply if you're a freelancer. We need to build the system to ask all the right questions. Whereas other states, Texas was one of them, Kentucky was one, Indiana was one, were saying, yeah, go ahead and apply. We'll figure out the math. So it'd be interesting to hear from these different states to see how things are going. But yeah, at least 2 freelancers have told me that they received their unemployment check, which is really, really good news. So money you think you'll get, right? This is part of that doing the math where you're thinking about, okay, how am I going to fund all those emergency expenses I have? If you've received your stimulus, that's a really good thing to sort of start partitioning out, if you will. If you've done the math, you know what your absolute essential expenses are. Maybe they're less than the stimulus money, maybe they're more. You know your situation certainly better than I do, but that can give you a sense of how much of those expenses are going to be covered. Now, I will tell you that is a one-time payment. There is a chance that Congress will extend it and introduce a second round of stimulus money, either through small business funding or through these checks that are going to individuals, but we don't know what they're going to do yet. So if you've gotten that money, I would say prioritize paying your essential expenses and do the math to kind of understand what those are. And that'll give you some insight into how long the stimulus money might last you. If you still have money coming in and you don't need the stimulus money, I would just hold tight to it. Leave it in a checking account or a savings account. This is not the time that I would say invest your $1,200. I would let it just hang out so that it's there if you need it. Because, you know, there's still some uncertainty when it comes to whether or not companies or organizations will be laying off people in the future or cutting hours. And if you've got that cash just kind of sitting there, it's like your security blanket that you're just kind of resting on. The other good news that was announced last week, I'm sure many of you saw this, is that there is a new financial assistance program. This is the Artist Relief Fund. This is a group of amazing organizations around the country, they're listed at the bottom of the slide here, have come together to put together this emergency grant assistance program. They are aiming to reach artists in all 50 states. So I would encourage you, if you meet the eligibility, go ahead and apply. I believe the grants are $5,000 grants, and they are meant to help people kind of get through this process. And by people, I mean specifically creative individuals getting through this process. Because, it's tough out there. So this is a really wonderful resource. Artistrelief.org is the website. And I would encourage you to check it out. You have probably already seen it. It's been all over social media from a lot of the state arts councils and of course from all of these major funder organizations. So between your ongoing income from paid gigs or salary, even if some of that has been curtailed, plus the stimulus money, plus unemployment if you are eligible for that, plus some of this emergency support and new income, by cobbling together all of these different potential sources of support, we hope that plus your savings, all of that emergency fund you've been building over time, will be enough to cover your expenses for the next period of time. But if it's still not enough, then there are other funds you can access. Obviously, if you have options to use your credit cards, that is a source of funding. That is not a fun source of funding I would prioritize. Definitely try to use any other options first. But this is a potential access for money if we're weighing the option between eating and not eating. Yeah, use your credit card. We'll figure out how to pay the debt off down the road, right? But if we're talking about more luxurious indulgences, now is not the time that I would suggest doing that. But you know yourself best, and you know what might be essential for you and what might not be. It is possible to think about some other work right now. I shared the story last week or maybe 2 weeks ago of an animator that I've been working with who was really, really excited to be able to take a part-time job in a warehouse, sort of restocking type of job. It is not the dream animator job he always wanted, but for him, having that part-time stable work and that paycheck coming in took so much pressure off of him. And so for him, that was the right choice kind of emotionally to make, just to bring some stability to his life. Now, that is not the right choice for everyone, but it is important that you know that there are some companies that are hiring right now. So depending on your circumstances and what makes sense for you, not to mention your own health profile, there are some options out there if you think that would make sense. If you don't think that would make sense and you are making it work with this other support and your savings and you've curtailed your expenses, then that's not something you need to worry about. It is also possible, as I mentioned, that there will be additional federal support coming, either through additional unemployment payments, maybe a second stimulus, maybe additional Small Business Administration support. We don't know what that's going to look like or if that is going to happen. We're hearing mixed things. Some people think that all the funding so far is sufficient. It just needs to get out to the humans that need it. Other people think it's insufficient and there will be another round. You can't really control that, but it is something to keep in mind as you are weighing these different options. And if you have other assets, you might think about whether or not using those other assets right now makes sense. Maybe this is dipping into your retirement. Again, that is not something I would advise as a general rule. But if you are weighing the options between eating and not eating, or receiving healthcare and not receiving healthcare, it seems like a pretty easy choice to make. If you have other investment accounts, I wouldn't say liquidate everything right now, but if you have maybe some mutual funds or some other investments that you would rather not sell, but you probably could, if that's going to be a difference maker for you, that's something you can think about. But in all of these contexts, it's important that you're doing the math. You know what your expenses are based on your current expenses and historically what they've have been. You know what your savings are and what's in your checking account and what your kind of debt profile is. And then you have a good sense of what money is still coming in, whether through emergency relief or stimulus payments or some ongoing income you might have. And then you're doing the math based on what makes sense for you and your family. There was a question again that came in about how should you manage cash. Cash is really delightful to have right now. And when I say cash, I don't necessarily mean the paper money you can touch. I mean quick access to money in a checking account or a savings account. So to the extent that you can prioritize having some money in your checking account and savings account, that's going to be really important. And watch it carefully. Pay attention to how it's being spent and do the math. We need to be planning for April, certainly. I would encourage you to also plan for May and maybe even June. I've already heard about a number of events that have gotten canceled in June, which will likely have a ripple effect through the creative community. So just keep paying attention, stay on top of what your normal summer looks like, and see what sort of planning you need to be doing. And that's going to be a very sort of personal reflection you're going through based on what your months normally look like. There was another question that came in about what long-term arts funding looks like. It's going to be tenuous. It's going to be probably tough for a while. As we know, all the models are wrong right now because people, organizations that I've been working with have been planning out for quick recoveries, really, really long recoveries, and then something in the middle. And so organizations are planning for multiple scenarios based on how this evolves over the next couple of months. So it's probably going to be lean and it's probably going to be tough. I would encourage you to plan for a slow bounce back. That means if you normally get funding from, say, your city arts council, and you happen to know that the city arts council is funded by a bed tax in your community, and the 2 or 3 major events that fund that bed tax have been canceled, you're probably looking at a 2-year period where that city funding is going to be much smaller than what you've gotten used to. There are also going to be more and more organizations and individuals in need of that funding. So there's probably going to be fewer dollars and higher demand for those dollars. All of which is to say, it's probably going to be tough. So I would encourage you, just like I'm encouraging the organizations, look at where you get your money, whether it's from individuals or grants or sponsorships, whatever your kind of revenue profile looks like. Look at that and then go funder by funder or sponsor by sponsor and see if you can kind of understand what they might be going through and see what their funding options might look like for the next year or so. Depending on who those funders are, many cities are already starting to release some information about when they think their city might rebound economically. I know the city of Columbus released something like that last week, I think it was, through the city auditor's office, which was really helpful. Depending on your city or your state, there might be good numbers coming out right now, or they might be still kind of fuzzy. But in any case, plan for kind of a slow revenue bounce back. To sort of illustrate this, this is a chart. I pulled it from an article in the Times as part of their coronavirus coverage right now. And I thought it was so interesting, and it was a helpful way to just sort of visualize what people are spending more and less on right now. And so these are just kind of individuals. What are they spending money on right now? You can see there was a spike in the spending on groceries. I think we all probably experienced that firsthand as people stocked up and wanted to kind of fill their pantries so that they could get through a 2-week at-home period if they ended up being quarantined. We've seen that fall down a little bit and get back to sort of a normal level of grocery spending after that initial spike. But you also see substantially less spending in health and beauty, entertainment and restaurants, transportation, and then especially shopping and travel. I think as if we were to project what this would look like long term, which I hesitate to do, but I think your grocery spending will probably stay about where it is. I could see health and beauty spending going a little bit back up. I could see entertainment and restaurants going a little bit back up, but is it going to go back to where it was 6 months ago? Maybe not. And certainly it probably won't be there in May or June. It might get there, but it might get there slowly. I think transportation will probably rebound as well because that is a necessary expense for many individuals. But it wouldn't surprise me if the amount individuals are spending on shopping and travel stays really low for a while, right? Because people are a little bit shell-shocked. A lot of people have been laid off, and a lot of individuals are really thinking about what's the absolute minimum they need to spend. And as we go through this recovery, health expenses are going to bounce back. Entertainment and restaurants are probably going to bounce back as we want to support those in our community that are continuing to operate those small businesses. And transportation will probably bounce back because it's necessary. but I imagine shopping and travel expenses will be much slower to bounce back. So if you think about this at sort of an individual level, it's easy to see how an economic recovery long-term, which is made up of individuals and companies, will be or could be pretty slow. So this is not to sort of scare you or make you panic or anything like that, just to sort of be aware that this might not be a super quick bounce back. And so that means you can start planning for a slower recovery and paying attention to some of the numbers. Again, doing the math is the ground rule of a financial pandemic that we want to be paying attention to. So again, there are some things you can control, and there are a lot of things you cannot control. But I would encourage you to continue to seek out support from your community and for those around you, because really the stories I'm hearing about artists reaching out and supporting each other, contributing to each other's emergency funds, if possible, grocery shopping for each other, all of these stories are really, really wonderful. They are what make a community thrive. So keep focused on the things you can control, really prioritize the things you need to do, and that includes self-care and definitely taking the time you need to process all the big feelings that are going on right now. And turning off Twitter if that's what you need from a self-care perspective. That's okay. I promise you will get the news you need in a timely way, and you can spend some time really doing what it makes sense for you to do right now. With that, that is our quick update. We got through all of the questions that I had received before about 2:30 today. So if your question wasn't answered, I will do my best to answer it next week or the next time we talk. Thanks again for joining us. I do want to remind you it's going to be okay. I know I say it every week, but it really will be. The good news is coming. Stimulus checks are going out. One person on this call has already received theirs. Unemployment benefits are going out, right? There is starting to become some breathing room in a lot of people's schedules and in their budgets, and that's relieving a lot of the anxiety. So keep doing the math, keep taking care of yourself and your family and your loved ones, and keep coming every Monday so we can have these conversations, because your questions make it so much more useful than me just sort of sharing things I've heard. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate all the messages that are coming through in the chat. Definitely stay tuned for the recording. Let me know via email if you have any additional questions, and I will look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, everyone.